And so really thinking about our patients and all of us during this pandemic, it's really a terrible time in that we have really the most number of patients with this, and our hospitals are quite stretched. Many people out sick, but there's a light at the end of the tunnel. So I'm really excited to hear what everyone has to say, to give us some information about the vaccine, give us hope, and help us get through this last push. They're going to talk about the good news and also the cautions regarding that, and when we can look forward to moving forward. Really great information, really excited to have them here today. So I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Bill Eisenberg, one of my colleagues, who's an OBGYN physician and leads Sutter Safety and Quality and has been really on the forefront of this work all year. So Bill, welcome.
Thank you very much, Liz. Good morning, everybody. As Liz mentioned, I'm Bill Eisenberg, the Chief Quality and Safety Officer for Sutter Health, and I have the distinct honor and pleasure of introducing my three colleagues for this morning's discussion. Firstly, Dr. Bernard Lowe. Bernie is was the Emeritus Director of the Program in Medical Ethics at UCSF and is currently the President of the Greenwell Foundation in New York. Bernie is a really well-known and respected medical ethicist of longstanding and has worldwide repute. Our next presenter is going to be Dr. Jeff Silvers, who's the Medical Director of Pharmacy and Infection Control for Sutter Health. And our last presenter this morning will be Dr. Randy Bergen, who's the immunization lead for Kaiser Permanente in Northern California. So I think you're all going to enjoy the presentations that each of our three doctors have put together for us. But before we get into their presentations, I think it might be useful just to get a level set of where the audience is to ask a question, ask a poll question for everybody. So Kat, could you please bring up the poll for us? Question we have for you is, would you take a COVID vaccine if it was available to you today? If you could all please put in a yes, no, or maybe, we would appreciate that. Okay, let's stop the poll now, Kat. I think we've got a number of people that have responded here. It looks like the majority of you, 2/3 of you, have said yes. This is a little bit higher than the last time about a month ago, we did a very similar presentation with a different Bay Area group, and the number there was around 50%. So looks like the news is becoming a little bit more optimistic and people are understanding the value of this vaccine a little better. But we hope that by the end of this, you'll have even more confidence and we can boost that number by several percentage points. So I think I'd like to move into a deeper dive of the vaccine and most importantly, what our three panelists who have, as Kat mentioned, been on the governor's panel for establishing guidelines for the state. Let's hear some more information from them. So I'd like to start with Dr. Bernie Lowe. So Bernie, if you could pull your slides up and let's hear from you, please.
Okay, it'll take me just a second to get my full screen slides up. And now I need to turn on my screen sharing. So thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here today. Can you all see, are you all seeing my slides? Who goes first with
Yes.
COVID vaccines?
Yep, we got it.
And why? So I'm delighted to be here and have the chance to talk with you and also just answer your questions along with my two colleagues. So first I want to, just as a caution, the California Vaccine Drafting Guidelines Working Group has not made its final recommendations, although I will indicate what's already official California policy. You all know that the FDA has issued emergency use authorization for one vaccine that has been shown to be effective and safe. And actually right today, the FDA Advisory Committee is considering a second vaccine, and that could be approved as soon as tomorrow. But there's going to be a shortage, at least at the beginning. So the real topic I'm going to address is who should go first and why. when there's not enough for all. So there are recommendations for who should be the first in line. The Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices makes recommendations, national recommendations to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And they've identified, number one, are frontline healthcare workers who provide care to patients and are exposed to COVID-19. And if you think about doctors, nurses, respiratory techs in the emergency department, intensive care units, et cetera, they have a high exposure, and they're really needed now more than ever as the number of open hospital beds is shrinking. In addition to those people, we have to think of first responders, and then the ancillary staff, the people who clean the hospital rooms, who transport patients from one part of the hospital to another. They're also exposed. The second big group are elderly people living in skilled nursing facilities and other congregate settings. They represent 40% of the COVID-19 deaths nationally. They're at high risk because their immune system is not quite as robust. And the congregate settings where they live mean that outbreaks spread. Along with them are the staff of nursing homes. And it's important to note that they often work in more than one long-term care facility, and they may be a means of spreading infection from one site to another. So and I just want to say that the state of California under the governor has already said that they will follow the national ACIP CDC guidelines, and these are the first groups being vaccinated now. Quick word about how much vaccine do we have. California got its first shipment. It's supposed to be projected to be 327,000 doses, but there may actually be more than the 5 doses that were thought to be in the vial. There may be 6 or perhaps even 7. So there may be more people who can get vaccinated. By the end of this month, the end of 2020, sorry, that should be 2020, not 2021. It's expected California will get 1.8 million more doses if the second vaccine is approved as expected. But the need is even greater. So there are 1.7 million healthcare workers in California, and there's 640 nursing home residents, and then there are other seniors living in assisted living facilities. So even though we've done the prioritization of those 2 big groups, within each of those groups, there's going to need to be further prioritization. And I think at all our area hospitals now, the number of doses the hospitals received really is not enough to vaccinate everyone. And so at least at my institution, they have really a number of tiers of who is at the highest risk, who is at the next highest risk, and so forth. And that's the order that people will be offered vaccination. Now, after that, who goes next? A lot of groups have a plausible claim to be next in line. School teachers. School children in California have suffered tremendously. Their social growth, their educational growth has really been harmed by the pandemic. And so starting school up and vaccinating teachers as a means to that has support. Schools also have other functions. They allow parents to go to work, be productive. And also in the California Schools Food Program, in participating institutions, 63% of students get meals at school. Our food chain is vital. It starts with the farm workers who harvest crops. And as you can see, they work in close quarters, and there have been outbreaks, significant outbreaks among farm workers. And as we know, in California, the majority of farm workers are Latinx. The rest of the food chain also is essential. There have been outbreaks among workers in meat processing plants nationally, and all the way down to the grocery clerks who interface with the public. They're also at increased risk because of their contacts, even with masks, which we don't see in this picture. And again, the numbers are large. So in California, 1.4 million people work in education and childcare sector. 3.4 million work in food and agriculture. So even by the end of the month of December, there won't be enough to vaccinate all in those groups. And then we have to think about who within those high priority groups really gets the highest priority. So I'm going to shift gears a little and dig a little deeper as to what are the reasons behind putting some categories more towards the top of the list? So one way to think about the groups we've already talked about is that there's category 1, those at very high risk for COVID infection and death. Number 2, those who care for COVID patients. Number 3, those whose jobs are essential for society reopening and functioning. And number 4, those who come from communities who have been most adversely impacted by COVID. Now, the next slide, I've added a second column with the reasons why we would put these occupational categories towards the top of the list. Those at very high risk, we want to vaccinate because that prevents the greatest number of COVID infections and death. And it also is a way of helping those in our society who are most in need. We've already talked about the value of vaccinating those who care for patients in hospitals. The third category of occupations that are essential for society, we really need to get the economic and social recovery going in the state, and prioritizing essential workers can help. And fourth, we want to try and vaccinate people from communities who have been hardest hit by the pandemic. And that's a way of improving equity. I'm going to spend a little more time on categories 3 and 4 to expand on that a bit. So who are essential workers? There's a list. There's a federal list from the Department of Homeland Security, and there's a state list from Governor Newsom's office. It's a big list. Up to 1/3 to half of all workers are deemed essential. So within those essential workers, the question we need to face is, who's at high risk? Who's at the highest risk? And those are people who can't work remotely, who have to work in close proximity to other people who have long or frequent interactions with others, and people who have frequent exposure to infection. So for example, I still have a small practice of primary care medicine, but I'm doing that through telemedicine. So I'm working remotely, and I shouldn't be at the head of the line for the vaccine. I fall way down. Equity. The COVID pandemic has really highlighted the huge disparities in health outcomes in this country. If we look at COVID cases and death by race or ethnicity, compared to whites, Blacks, Hispanics, Native Americans have a 2.5 to 3-fold increase in cases, almost a 5-fold increase in hospitalizations, and also an increase in deaths. So they've been really hard hit. There's an interaction between equity and essential workers. In California, Latinx essential workers make up a disproportionately high percentage of essential workers. They hold the majority of low-wage essential jobs, and they disproportionately lack health insurance. And their risk is also increased because they often live in crowded housing, and often they more likely have jobs that don't have paid sick leave. So if you think of essential industries being what I think a lot of the companies in Silicon Valley do, the high tech or computer industries, they're clearly essential. But a lot of those perhaps can be done through telecommuting. So who comes after the healthcare workers and elderly and skilled nursing facilities and other congregate living settings? The ACIP hasn't yet made its recommendations on that, and this is something the California Vaccine Working Group is actively working on. The National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine has made recommendations. They identified a phase 1B, and they put people with 2 or more factors for significantly higher risk. And these are people with chronic illnesses, diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, chronic lung disease, and so forth. Phase 2, under these recommendations, include K-12 teachers, staff, childcare workers, critical workers at high risk, people who have factors for moderately higher risk, so people who live in shelters, group homes, prisons, and staff at those facilities, and then all older adults. Phase 3 then is workers who are important to restoring the economy, children and young adults, although we don't have clinical trials yet in children under age 16. They're starting, they're ongoing. Phase 4 is everyone else. And so when we will get through all these phases really depends on how quickly companies can ramp up production and how we can distribute it. So I'm just give you a take-home message. First, reasonable people will disagree on priorities, and we can see it in the state of Ohio, for example, and the country of Great Britain, have put nursing home patients at the very top of the list and healthcare workers under them. I think guidelines are important because they provide consistency, and consistency, I think, helps to build trust that the process is fair. I think it would be really chaotic if different hospitals in a city or different cities in the same county use different guidelines for who gets priority. At the same time, guidelines can be a little rigid sometimes, and you need discretion to provide flexibility. So as I mentioned before, every hospital has to figure out who among their workers are at the very highest risk, who they need to prioritize for the vaccine they have in hand. So there's remaining challenges, to be sure, how to deliver the vaccine, how to persuade people to accept it when their turn comes. And that's really what my next two, my colleagues will do in the next 2 talks. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bernie. We really appreciate your presentation. I think we're going to move on to Dr. Jeff Silvers, who will talk a little bit more about the vaccine itself and give us some details, both from a historical perspective, but also the newly emerging ones now that we're starting to administer the vaccine. So Jeff, would you like to take it away?
Yeah, so I just need to figure out how I'm going to present this to you here. I may have lost this. Kat, can you show my slides?
Yes, give me just a moment to bring them up.
Yeah, maybe a little faster. So what I'm going to talk about today, of course, is the COVID vaccine. And clearly it's the most anticipated vaccine since the polio vaccine. And you have to understand the polio vaccine took about 35 years to be developed. And we're doing this in 1 year. It's pretty incredible what it means. And while she's pulling those up, you're still pulling them, right?
Yes, I am. I'll have
Okay.
them up in just a moment.
No problem. So while she's pulling those up, I'll just talk about a couple of things. So just think about even HIV. If we had had a vaccine for HIV in 1 year, and understand we still don't have one because it's much harder, we've lost 34 million people in the world from HIV. And so this is quite a remarkable scientific achievement. You can move a couple slides down now. Next slide. There we go. So here's some examples of different types of vaccines. That you can have a weakened live virus or a dead virus, or you can have alternative virus genetically modified, which is kind of the AstraZeneca type of vaccine, the Janssen vaccine. Adjuvanted protein particles like the Novavax, subunits of this viral genetic sequences. This is what the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines are, or conjugate vaccines. Next slide. So the FDA came up with requirements for approval that it must prevent or at least lessen severity in more than half of the people who receive the vaccine. And they were willing actually to accept only 30%, which you have to understand would have meant it was less effective than even a flu vaccine. So not sure that would be very good, or would have been very good. Monitoring must happen for at least 2 months after the last dose, and that's very important, and that was one of the reasons it's taken us to this point in time to have the vaccine released. Cases are counted at minimum of 7 days after the last dose, the second dose of the vaccine for the mRNA vaccines. The Moderna decided 14 days, the Pfizer 7 days. That's very arbitrary. You must look at safety and efficacy, and the trials must have diversity in age and race and ethnicity so that we can make sure that it works for everyone who receives it. And of course, an EUA will be made on a case-by-case basis. So if you look at the next slide here, you can look at the New York Times actually tracks the vaccine trials that are in various phases. And phase 1 and 2 are pretty much combined for vaccines, although for medications, they're separate. And those tend to be very small numbers of people, just making sure that people can tolerate the vaccine, and their trials to try and figure out what would be the best dose to use in a phase 3 trial. The phase 3 trials, you can see there's 16 right now in that look at a minimum usually of 30,000 people, usually 15,000 in placebo and 15 or some sort of control, and 15,000 receive the vaccine. It's the smallest N. And then there's 2 approved vaccines, one of which is, of course, the Pfizer that we have, and then there's the Sputnik vaccine has been approved, but we don't obviously have that. The next slide. So let's talk about vaccine development. So it's pretty simple as how we look at this. If you look at the drawing in the right corner, you'll see what looks like a crown, the coronavirus. This is what we'll talk about is a virus that's kind of shaped like a crown. And those red spikes coming from it are the famous spike protein. And that's the part of the virus that attaches to the cell in the human host that enables the virus to enter the respiratory cells of the human host and then create havoc. And if we could create an antibody that would bind to that S protein, then the virus can't bind to the respiratory cell, and gosh, gee, that would be great. So what you need to do is you need to find the protein or the pathogen that you need to counter. For us, it's that S spike protein that you see drawn there. And then you need to code the sequence of the gene making that protein, which is it's a messenger RNA that makes that protein. And then you have to create a vaccine using that code. So we give people mRNA, and then it gets into the body and it makes the S protein, and then your body makes the antibodies against that S protein. And then if you get exposed to the virus, voila, you're ready to go for it. So let's talk about mRNA vaccines on the next slide. So there's 2 vaccines. One's approved, that's the Pfizer BioNTech, and one likely approval actually within the next 7 days, probably as early as today for the FDA, but then it goes through ACIP and CDC and state approval and ... So within the next week. Each of them require 2 doses. They're not interchangeable. They both are modified mRNA nanoparticles. So they're extremely small particles, and they modify them so that they're more stable when they give them. So they're not exactly the same as the mRNA in the virus, but they're very similar. But they modify such that it lasts a little bit longer in the body so that they can make that S protein, and then you can make antibody. The Pfizer vaccine has extremely complex storage requirements, which has required Pfizer to come out with incredible ways to store and transfer this product so that it remains usable. The next slide talks about some mRNA vaccine important points you need to remember. Number one, this is not a live vaccine. Number two, it does not contain a whole virus. It just contains a small segment of mRNA to make a specific protein. Number three, it doesn't enter the nucleus of the human cell, it only stays in the cytoplasm. The relevance is the DNA of your body is in the nucleus. And this is RNA, it can't incorporate into that DNA. Number four, it's degraded very quickly by normal cellular processes. The half-life is about 8 to 10 hours, and that's enough time for your body it's enough time for the mRNA to make the S proteins and then your body to start responding. Number five, there are no fetal cells during the development or production. Let me make sure everybody understands this because there's questions about that. There are no fetal cells during the development or production. There's lots of references and sites that support that statement and religious leadership who have agreed with that. The vaccines produced completely in vitro. It does not use any animals. It doesn't use eggs. It's just in bats. Now, it might not produce effective mucosal immunity. So mucosal immunity is what you need to prevent the virus from being, taking residence in your airway, your nose and your mouth area. And so the vaccine will prevent disease from you getting disease, but it may not prevent you from carrying the virus for a period of time and then giving the virus to other people. So that's why after the vaccine, people are still going to have to mask and do social distancing and good hand hygiene and all the other things we've been talking about. So let's talk about the Pfizer NTech on the next slide here. It was approved December 10th, 1 week ago. The Advisory Committee of Immunization Practices, that's a branch of the CDC, approved it on December 11th. It's approved for people 16 years of age and older. They did study down to age 12, but they didn't increase that their criteria down to 12 until partway through the study, so they don't have enough data yet to get approval for that. Efficacy, 95%. This is amazing. Remember, the FDA said 50%, and they were willing to go to 30%, which upset me a lot, but I will show you statistics of what this means with 95% as we go a little further down. Adding persons who had prior disease does not change the results. If you look at whether you've had COVID previously and get the vaccine or whether you've not had COVID, the results are the same, 95%. So what were the results? The next slide shows that. They had about 170, first of all, each of these studies needs about 150 participants to develop COVID after the vaccine, and then they could sort it out to people who had placebo from those who got the vaccine. So Pfizer had 170 participants when they applied for their EUA. 162 of the 170 had gotten that placebo, which was just salt water. 9 of those people had severe disease. Out of the 8 patients who developed COVID after receiving the vaccine, now that's measured by, you got 2 doses, 3 weeks apart, and a minimum of 7 days after the second dose. One of those people did get severe disease. Out of the 8, that person did not require hospitalization and ended up doing well. So now the question is, how much protection do you get between the 2 doses? And that is 1 dose enough? So it takes the doses are 3 weeks apart. It takes 7 days after a dose to get your vaccine immunity to kind of respond. And you want to measure how many people got COVID between the 2nd and 3rd weeks. The first week is giving your chance to produce immunity. Week 2 and 3, did you get some immunity from the first dose? So the answer is yes. 39 people who got the vaccine developed COVID in weeks 2 and 3, 82 with placebo, 52% efficacy. But notice, this is very important, after the first dose, the number of people who had severe disease was basically just as high in people who had the vaccine or placebo. So yes, it did prevent disease half the time, but it didn't prevent severe disease. And those are people who get hospitalized and are at risk of dying. The efficacy was consistent, didn't matter about race, ethnicity, gender, age. It's wonderful. Older adults, one of the only blessings I can see for being older, and older in this case is defined as 56 years old or older than that, actually have fewer milder adverse events. Now, it may be because your immune reaction is less, and so I'm not sure that's all really a good thing, but at least I'll be more comfortable. Side effects are on the next slide, and we think that the side effects are related to your body's immune response. So if you have more if you have more side effects, you very well may be having more of an immune response, which in the end will be a good thing. Pain at the injection site, extremely common. Figure about 4 out of 5 people. Less than 1 in 20, though, will have swelling and redness, but the pain and tenderness is real. It's kind of like the shingles vaccine, definitely a lot more than you get with a flu vaccine. I had the Shingrix vaccine, and I have no problems with other vaccines at all, but the Shingrix vaccine, my arm was definitely sore for a couple of days. I anticipate the same thing with this COVID vaccine. After the sore arm, what do you see? Well, fatigue, headache, and fevers are the most common. But fatigue and headache are really common in placebo also. And the fact is that if you look at the data, that almost 50% of the people after the first dose will complain of fatigue if they got the vaccine. But by the way, over a third of the people will have the same complaint who all they got was saline. And the same thing with headaches. It's much more common in people it's more common in people who receive the real vaccine versus the placebo, but there's only an absolute difference of 8%, which really isn't very much. It's when you get to the second dose that they really differentiate, and then the fatigue and headaches are twice as common in people who have received the vaccine versus the placebo, and the severity is definitely higher. It's more moderate than mild. Fevers are definitely common and occur in about 16% of the people. That's a pretty high number when you recognize that they only occur in about 1 to 2% of people who get the flu shot. And occasionally they will be quite high. People take antipyretics. They don't last, typically very long, usually 12 hours or less, sometimes a day. I'm sure there'll be some people, it's going to be a few days, but hopefully those will be lower grade. And again, all these side effects are more common after the second dose, more severe after the second dose, and more noticeable in people that are 55 years old or younger. The next slide talks about herd immunity. And this is important and why I talk about the 50% versus 95% vaccine efficacy. So people have talked about, is there such a thing as herd immunity with this virus? And I don't know that there is, but here's how we calculate it. If you take the R0 is a measurement of one person has contagious disease and they are in a crowd of people who are not immune. How many people will get that disease from that one person? So with COVID, we assume it's about 2.5. Now, this is kind of a moving target. Flu, it's about 1.5. Measles is the most contagious. It's about 12 to 16. Now, this 2.5 doesn't account for super spreaders. It doesn't take into account all the wonderful things we're trying to get people to do with masking, social distancing. But once you accept that number, then herd immunity equation is 1 minus 1 divided by the R0, which comes out to 0.6 or 60%. But that assumes that the vaccine is 100% effective, or the vaccine plus people who've had disease will be 100%. So using the vaccine equation, though, you have to take that 0.6, you have to divide it by epsilon, which in this case is 95%, so 0.95. So in order to provide herd immunity, it comes out to 0.63, 63% need to be vaccinated. If that vaccine only worked 50%, it would have been 0.6 divided by 0.5, meaning that there would be no such thing as herd immunity. So very quickly, what's likely to come next, 7 days, is really the Moderna vaccine. That's the next slide. And then the data will be very similar after that, and that's the slide after that. It will go down to age 8. And here's my conclusions on the last slide, that we're in the next phase of a historical pandemic with vaccine efficacy exceeding expectations. We are seeing history. Now is our opportunity to put all of our work into action. Vaccine efficacy after 2 doses is 95%. First dose is only 50%, probably will not last as long and may not prevent severe disease. And yes, people do react to the vaccine, but the benefit really outweighs the risk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. You know, it was great when you said that the herd immunity number is around 63%, and I'm remembering our number from our poll was 62%. So if everybody on this call sticks with what they said they do, I guess we would get herd immunity from just from that small sample we have here. But we'd really still like a larger number. That would be a great goal. And to that point, there's 38% that were not immediately bought into getting it. So that brings up the whole topic of hesitancy about getting a vaccine. And to help address that point, we have Dr. Randy Bergen from Kaiser Permanente, who oversees their immunization program. And so, Dr. Bergen, if you'd like to talk about vaccine hesitancy and what things we can do to address those concerns.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kat, for pulling up my slides. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
All right, perfect. So thank you so much. It's definitely an honor to present to you all, and it's really a delight to present with the two other presenters I have. I know I have two great lifelines. If I stumble in my presentations, that between Bernie and Jeff, they can take over and help me out. My presentation, there will definitely be some overlap from Jeff's and hopefully some kind of additional content. But I also want to kind of hit on the topic, is the vaccine safe? And before I do, though, I really want to emphasize, you know, okay, about 2/3 of you are ready to go, and about 1/3 of you aren't. And for that third, that's okay. And I'm not going to feel like at the end of this presentation, if the numbers haven't changed, that I somehow haven't done my job. I think the three of us, our charge here is to just give you more information. This is an individual decision. We need to, you know, meet each individual where they are. But knowledge is power for the individual. So it's our job to try to kind of give you as much knowledge as we can. And I'd like to kind of emphasize to you that I think the process has been safe. So let's go to the first slide. So in a normal world, when a vaccine is tested and then goes to market, this is what happens. The pharmaceutical company that is developing the vaccine goes through a series of trials that Jeff already kind of alluded to. There's phase 1 trials, which are very, very small numbers, usually in the 10s to maybe 100, looking primarily at the dosage of the vaccine and starting to get some initial safety data. Then there's phase 2 trials, which are usually in the hundreds to maybe up to 1,000. Focusing more on additional safety information, and then beginning to look at the idea of whether there is protection. The protection that's looked at in phase 2 trials is primarily kind of laboratory protection. So seeing whether antibodies are produced, seeing the other types of immune responses, and then finally, and only before you know, we even think about offering this vaccine to the population, we go to phase 3 trials. And phase 3 trials require thousands and thousands of people. They further drill down on the safety issues. They look for not only efficacy in the laboratory, but they look at efficacy of the vaccine in the real world. And even if all these things occur, then the vaccine goes through a rigorous process of post-licensure follow-up. And every vaccine needs this, even though you're testing tens of thousands of people. You know, some things only happen 1 out of 100,000 or 1 out of 1,000,000. So this post-licensure information is incredibly important for us to continue to get information about what groups should or shouldn't get a vaccine. Once phase 3 trials are completed, then the vaccine companies go to the FDA. The FDA in their advisory committee reviews the data. If they deem the vaccine safe and effective, then they approve it. And then it goes to the Centers for Disease Control, where the advisory committee on immunization practices reviews that same data and decides who should get the vaccine and who shouldn't, the specific guidelines. So that's what happens in a normal situation. Next slide, please. Is anything different with this vaccine? No. Basically, all of the vaccines that we're looking at, the vaccines that are still being developed, are going through those same exact processes. The 2 vaccines we're primarily talking about today have already completed phase 3 trials. At least the initial part of those phase 3 trials, everyone has been looked at for a total of 60 days at least since they've been vaccinated. And pretty much every vaccine expert feels like that is a very, very significant length of time in order to determine the vast majority of the side effects. In this particular case with these 2 vaccines, because it has only been 60 days, it's more normal to look at side effects for a longer period of time. The decision was made to license the Pfizer and probably the Moderna vaccine under an emergency use authorization. That is not necessarily the standard procedure, but given the gravity of the pandemic that we're in right now, I feel completely comfortable and completely safe that this is the right thing to do. There also are some advantages in licensing a vaccine or authorizing vaccine through emergency use authorization. It doesn't slow down the production of other vaccines, which we know that we're going to need in the same category. So actually standard licensure is not the approach that we should be taking in this particular context, because we do not want to in any way to discourage other vaccine manufacturers from continuing to develop their vaccine. We've added in an additional layer within the Western states. The Western states are, and California included, as part of a consortium that has a number of vaccine experts, vaccine scientists that are highly well respected, that will then look at the data that the CDC and the FDA is worked on to further vet whether this vaccine should be given to Californians. The California Second Safety Oversight Group has already approved the Pfizer vaccine, and certainly it's anticipated that they will do the same thing with the Moderna vaccine. And then as even a final degree of oversight is the group that Jeff and Bernie are on to help to kind of prioritize who should get the vaccine. Next slide, please. So this is again kind of a recapitulation of what Jeff has mentioned. These are the stages that we're in, and basically for the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine, we're in the process of distributing and administering the vaccine. The Moderna vaccine, maybe even as we speak, it's already been approved because the FDA is meeting right now. The ACIP is planning on meetings on Friday and Saturday. And if they do approve, then the Western State Scientific Safety Committee will also meet and provide their decision. And then the vaccine will be distributed presumably next week. Next slide, please. What is being recommended right now with the Pfizer vaccine? There are clearly risk groups that we're not going to offer it to, and groups that we are going to offer it to, and there still is, some uncertainty in terms of where some of these categories might specifically fall. But in terms of what we know right now, it's a no, hard stop if you've had a severe reaction to components of the vaccine. And don't move to the next slide yet, but the next slide will actually show you the components of the vaccine. So spoiler alert, that's coming. In terms of maybe, if you've had severe reactions to other vaccines and other severe types of allergic reactions. As you know, in the UK, there were 2 cases of anaphylaxis, and I understand there were 2 cases of anaphylaxis just reported in Alaska with the Pfizer vaccine. Those incidents are being watched very closely. It is definitely recommended that there be an observation period of at least 15 minutes after vaccination. It's recommended that vaccination sites have the wherewithal in terms of medicines and staff to safely take care of someone that is having an anaphylactic reaction. All 4 of those individuals are doing just fine, and all 4 of those reactions reportedly happened within minutes of getting the vaccine. It's still kind of to be determined what we should be doing with that category, but at this point, it's still a maybe, and check with your doctor. And then probably, while it's not been studied, pregnancy and breastfeeding, we are encouraging women in those 2 categories to think about the vaccine, and our present status is that we would not recommend withholding the vaccine from anyone who is in those two categories who wishes to receive the vaccine. And that's, kind of evidence medicine speak for, well, we don't have the evidence for sure because we haven't studied it yet, but there's really no biologic plausibility that pregnancy is going to be a problem, that the fetus is going to be affected, and the same thing for breastfeeding. So we really, really, really do believe this is going to be safe. We just don't have the evidence yet. And then for folks that are immune compromised, certainly your immune response may not be quite as good because of your weakened immune system, but it is recommended for those folks. And then people that had a past COVID infection, it's also recommended. As Jeff alluded to, in kind of in some of the study, interval, people did get COVID, and those people actually did better when they were vaccinated. We are kind of putting kind of a caveat that if you've had COVID documented within the last 90 days, you probably do have good natural protection, at least for the short term. So maybe you want to kind of step aside from the line to make sure that other people who maybe need it more will get it, but definitely over the long haul, we want you to get vaccinated too. And then the only other caveat, we really don't know what the effect will be in combination with other vaccines. So for now, with an abundance of caution, we're just kind of focusing on not giving it to people if you've received a vaccine within 14 days before or 14 days after. So you've been wondering, what is a vaccine? So what components of the vaccine should you be worried about? The next slide shows you the components. And I won't even begin to pronounce any of them because I can't. There's messenger RNA, and there's basically 4 very complex lipids. These lipids, as Jeff has described, provide kind of the envelope that protects the messenger RNA, that allows it to enter into our cells. Basically, I would not worry about the potassium chloride and the sodium chloride and the sucrose part. Basically, having severe allergic reactions to those things, which are kind of essential for life, is kind of impossible. Unfortunately, what this means is that many people that may have severe allergic reactions to some of these components will not know it until they get a first dose, because many of these things haven't been tested. But again, with the rigor that we're doing right now in terms of observation period and making sure that all the correct equipment is there, I think that it's a very safe proposition for most folks. Next slide, please. So I'm more of a visual learner. So this is basically the same information that Jeff has provided. If you're a vaccine expert and you're presenting on the topic of the efficacy of your vaccine, this is kind of a mic drop moment. You basically just have to show this slide and you can walk off the stage. This is what happened with the individuals in the Pfizer trial. It doesn't include those folks who did get COVID in between the first and second dose. These are people that completed the 2 doses without getting COVID. The blue is the vaccinated people, and the red are the people that received placebo. And each one of those little squares or circles are a case of COVID. And you can see after around kind of 7 to 14 days, there were very, very few cases of COVID in the people that got vaccinated. So boy, I wish every vaccine had a curve like this, because it would certainly mean that maybe Jeff and I would be a lot less busy than we are. So this is just astounding. And if we move to the next slide, one of the issues when you do have a vaccine that is that effective is there clearly are side effects. I mean, this vaccine really stimulates the immune system. And this is also what kind of Jeff was alluding to. Want to call your attention to the fact that the fatigue column and the headache column and the chills, well, especially the fatigue and the headache column, there's a lot of folks in the placebo group that were also positive. So that, when you get a vaccine, especially a new thing, you're part of a study, there's a certain amount of suggestibility there. We believe what we want to believe. And certainly people in the placebo group experience the fatigue and the headache. But there's absolutely no question that the folks in the fever group and the chills group, that there was a significant difference, and especially if you look at the second dose. Only 1% of the people in the second dose of placebo got fever, whereas 16% did in the COVID, and 4% for chills and versus 35%. So there's no question there's a very high probability you're not going to feel that great after you get the vaccine, and especially the second dose. But again, that's not a sign you're getting COVID. That's a sign that the vaccine is stimulating your immune system to give you protection against COVID. So next slide, please. Will I be getting a COVID vaccine if it's approved? If we move on to the next slide, the answer is yes. And I'll absolutely be recommending it to my colleagues and my patients and my family as well. I'm not seeing patients inpatient, so I don't quite qualify yet. We're actually starting to get vaccine at my medical center right now. But I'm in kind of the next tier with the outpatient staff. And as soon as my turn, I'm going to be giving the vaccine. So my last few slides, I really just want to kind of emphasize the process that we should all be going through. So if you're in that 2/3 group that's ready to go, great. You may well be talking to folks that are in the 1/3 group. And these are some of the things that I would think about. And for those of you that are in that 1/3 group, in the discussion that you have amongst others, I would like you to kind of consider these things too. We all have to meet each other kind of where we are. And the critical thing is that we employ empathy, that we're not just dealing with facts, but also feelings. If somebody doesn't agree with you, it's not the time to get angry or upset. It is the time to really kind of try to understand the other person and where they are, and communicate your understanding back. And again, to kind of show empathy. That's the way to kind of make a difference and to move people forward to make the decision that's right for them. If we move on to the next slide. Here's a few other kind of basic tips. Get curious, not furious. You definitely don't want to be showing your emotions. You don't have to be right here, because everybody's right answer might be different in this particular situation, because it is an individual choice. And ask the right questions. Try to reframe things. Be a good listener. Respond in clear and definitive ways. I often have to kind of remind myself that as a physician, so sometimes I can't provide a lot of certainty, but I can do my best to focus on clarity, do my best to provide the data, to provide the information in the clearest possible way as I can, knowing that I can't always provide the certainty. And then finally, emphasize that the relationship is clearly the most important thing. If after this presentation you're still not ready to get vaccinated, that's fine. But the vaccine will be ready for you down the line if you do change your mind. And the discussion will always be available to you to talk more. So I think that's the end of my presentation. Yes, that's the last slide. So turn it back to Bill, and I think we're happy to take on other of your questions.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful summary, and I appreciate the presentations from all three of our panelists today. I think we'd like to now move into the Q&A session. And I've got to say, we've already had some really great questions come in. It's wonderful to moderate a session with such smart people that ask great questions like you already have done. I'm going to start. There's been a question about when we talk about doses, are we talking about the number of people that can be vaccinated, or are we talking about we get a million doses and that means we can vaccinate 500,000 people? So Jeff, can you clarify when we're talking about doses, what does that mean?
Yeah, so the CDC has defined doses. Well, first of all, they are reserving the second dose for every dose that they send out. So if they send out 1 million doses, they already have plans to reserve another 1 million doses, which will not be counted as another shipment. So every time they send a shipment, that's presuming that they've saved an equal amount for a second dosing.
Great, thank you very much. So I've got a second question, a really interesting one, which Eddie Erickson asked, and there's a follow-up question embedded in that from Jim Davis. So these mRNA vaccines are pretty new, and not a lot. We don't think a lot of humans have gotten them before. So what about longer-term downstream effects to the body? Some that could even take years to manifest. And then a follow-up question. in fact, are there possibilities that these antibodies that are engendered from the mRNA vaccines could actually block beneficial receptors on cells? So both those questions, whoever wants to answer them.
So Randy,
I can take a stab, and Jeff, you can
Yeah.
correct me or add. Well, I mean, as Jeff has kind of alluded to, that there's two critical things that this messenger RNA vaccine can't do. The messenger RNA doesn't get into our genetic information. It doesn't get into our cells. The messenger RNA degrades really quickly. So the biologic plausibility that there will be any downstream effects from this vaccine is very remote. I mean, remote doesn't mean zero, and 1 in a million things can happen. One of the problems with being a scientist is that we still do have to have that disclaimer, that we do have to say the 1 in a million is still possible, unlike politics, where you can be absolutely clear on things that are maybe even absolutely false. We as scientists can't do that. But again, as a scientist looking at the data, there's very, very little biologic plausibility that there's going to be any downstream effects. The other question about producing a lot of antibodies to the spike protein is also a very interesting question, because that spike protein binds to a really important receptor site on our epithelial cells. It's called the ACE2 receptor site, and that binding triggers a lot of effects within the host cell that may be part of the reason that COVID does what it does. So far, there's been no evidence of people having any serious side effects from it. But again, that's something that downstream will have to follow. Jeff, I don't know if you have any better answer, especially to the second part of that question.
no, I think that's true, but you have to also remember that the antibody you're making doesn't bind to that ACE2 receptor. It binds to the S protein by the virus. So you would have to have something else in your body happen that binds to that antibody, and then that binds to the ACE2 receptor. So I don't know exactly what that's going to be. So I think theoretically, no, but obviously as scientists, we don't know. And then just one little quick clarification. When Randy said the mRNA doesn't enter into the cell, it actually does. It does not enter into the nucleus.
Yeah, I meant the nucleus. Thanks, Jeff.
Bernie, did you have a comment also before we move
Yeah,
on?
can I add a comment? I think these are great questions. I love what Randy and Jeff said. It's going to be very hard to figure out if something bad happens to someone who got a vaccine, whether it was due to the vaccine or was caused by something else. So we're going to be vaccinating a lot of people who live in elderly, frail people in long-term care facilities. Some of them are going to have other things happen. Some of them are going to die because elderly people in nursing homes die. I just had a patient a week ago not wake up after his sleep. There's going to be a tendency to ascribe that to the vaccine because something happened and then something happened later. We're not going to be able to follow people in the placebo group who over the long term, because ethically, at some point, they're going to have to be offered the vaccine if they got the placebo. So we're going to depend on big institutions to keep lots of records that people can go back to try and sort out. Are the side effects more common in people who got the vaccine than in the background population? So remember Jeff Silver's slide about the short-term side effects. Things happened in the placebo group as well as in the vaccine group.
Thanks, Bernie, for that. I would like to ask the CEO of SVLG to actually ask a question. I think he has one that he wanted to pose directly.
I do. Ahmad Thomas here, CEO of SVLG, and thank you all so much. Such an esteemed panel. Liz is on our board, and the feedback that you all have given us is extremely timely and very, very, very much appreciated. My question is about communities of color, and in particular, the take-up rate related to the vaccines. And Bernie, you touched on the impact in terms of the disproportionate effect on our communities of color. But I'm frankly surprised at our 68% yes rate in the poll. I don't know if we're doing one at the end here and it goes up, but I talk to my own family members who have deep concerns, which you could argue are warranted, and are nervous about getting this vaccine. What should we be doing as leaders in the business community, our companies, SVLG, to help ensure that those disproportionately impacted by COVID are actually getting vaccinated? Because I think the fear is real in our communities.
Yeah, so
Great question. Bernie, you want to take that one?
if I could take the first step, I think that's a really important and challenging question. And so polls that are taken on a nationally representative sample find that willingness to be vaccinated is much lower among people in the African-American community and the Latinx community. And if you drill down and ask what the concerns are, I mean, a sizable proportion of people think that the COVID vaccine was designed or could give you COVID, and that it was designed to harm African Americans. So these thoughts are out there in the community. There's a lot of reasons, given what happens in the society in this day and age, as well as historical things, for people to be mistrustful. So I think, to tie into Randy's point, you have to meet people where they are in their decision making. I think there needs to be a lot of good public messaging campaigns. I think leaders who are respected by people, for instance, African Americans, have to sort of give the message, show they're getting vaccinated. But even there, it may not be convincing. So former President Obama has said he will get vaccinated in public and he will encourage African Americans to get vaccinated. But then when you talk to people in the street, someone will say, sure, that's fine. If something happens to him, he'll get the best medical care. I don't have health insurance. I can't get an appointment. Innovative strategies are really needed. The mayor of Washington, D.C. is really thoughtful about this. And she's identifying fire departments as places where people of color can get vaccinated, because she says people trust the fire department in a way they may not trust the police department. And fire departments are located geographically across the city. But I think you have to turn to the Black churches, the barber shops, the beauty salons, where people go and have trustful conversations to really disseminate the message. Having said that, African Americans trust their doctors, even if they're not African American. They trust African American doctors more. But I think those of us who aren't can still play a role in doing exactly what Randy suggested, sort of helping, meeting people, letting them express their concerns, and trying to help them make the best decision for themselves.
It's a really good question that you've asked, Ahmad, because not only is there hesitancy there, but those separate groups also have higher risks because of background chronic diseases such as diabetes, asthma, that predispose them to worse outcomes should they become infected with COVID. So it's really impingent on us in the health systems to come up with effective communication strategies to help our vulnerable populations understand why it's critically important that they embrace vaccination. So we appreciate that, and I'm confident, I know here at Sutter, and I'm confident that at KP and UCSF, we're also using similar outreach strategies to maximize people's acceptance of this vaccine.
And can I make an additional comment, Bill?
Of course, please.
Yes, so I've been, working in, kind of vaccine issues, for 30 plus years. I think the thing that we may not get this right, but we are recognizing an important thing that I don't think we've ever really talked about before with vaccines. I mean, I was involved in the Hib vaccine release in the 80s, and the Prevnar vaccine in the 90s, and the varicella vaccine in the 90s, and lists them all, and we've never talked about these things before, and it's always been important, but it hasn't been spoken. So at least now there's a clear emphasis on this, and we're bringing in experts like Bernie into the discussion with our guidelines group, and the governor is developing a huge community advisory council, and the right people are now coming to the table to help us get this right. And no, we're not going to get it perfect, but it's so much further along, and it's so gratifying for me as someone kind of approaching the end of my career that these things are now being spoken and being addressed. And we certainly need all of you to be thought leaders and encouragers. People of color are clearly going to be better spokespeople than I am for the importance of this vaccine and the safety of this vaccine. So, just bravo to all of you out there that want to take a role in this. We need you all.
Thanks, Randy. I have another question, and it's a really good one because we're all reminiscent of getting our flu vaccines earlier on. Is this vaccine going to be one that we have to take every year?
So I'll take a stab at that one. And of course, that's a maybe. We don't know the data yet. Looking at the related virus, the respiratory coronaviruses that we see every year, they do get recurrent infections, and that's a real possibility. But we'll need more time to see. One is the very high titer antibodies that you get after the vaccine. They will gradually wane, but how long will they stay high enough to protect you? And two, at this point in time, even though the virus has been mutating, it appears to be mutating in a way that the vaccine should still work. It's a very different mechanism than the way the flu virus mutates. So it's a definite maybe. And if they are, then we can hope that they will be incorporated together so that you only get one shot a year.
Jeff, I have a follow-up question, maybe for you, but maybe for Randy. This whole question about mucosal immunity, and you get your vaccine, but you're still expected to wear a mask. I think most of us are like so over mask wearing. It's just something none of us love. But if it may be in our future, if it may mean that this mucosal immunity is never granted by vaccination, and we can be protected from getting disease, but not necessarily protected from carrying disease, when will we know definitively whether or not mucosal immunity comes along with vaccination?
Yeah, so there's a couple pieces. Randy, do you want to take that?
Oh, go ahead. Okay. You're on a roll.
So there's a couple pieces to that equation. Number one is most mucosal immunity is what we call IgA immunity, not IgG. And the antibodies we develop are IgG antibodies. So that's one. The other part is that we know from measles vaccine that if you get a certain titer response to the vaccine, that you are prevented from getting disease, but you're still contagious. But if you get a much higher titer, you are no longer contagious, as well as not being at risk of getting disease. So we developed a vaccine such that we get a high enough titer that you not only don't get disease, but you're no longer contagious. When will we know that with the COVID vaccine? Probably, it's going to take a little while. There's some very specific antibody tests that are finally becoming available that hopefully can help answer that. So I don't know exactly when, but it wouldn't surprise me if we have more information, say, within the next 6 months.
Great. That's wonderful to hear. I have a really interesting and provocative question. I don't know who is the one that wants to answer this. Maybe Bernie, you talked about essential workers. How and when will the state prioritize semiconductor industry as an essential group of workers?
Right, it's certainly essential. My computer would die if we didn't have the semiconductors.
Right.
So again, I just want to say that right now we're thinking not just essential workers, but high-risk essential workers. And so until we get enough vaccine supply, we're going to have to do not just is the occupation essential, but what jobs in there are really have people at high risk because they're interacting with others, they're exposed to others. So maybe it's in the manufacturing part. It's industry specific.
Yeah, we had to think about not just essential interacting other people, but you also may provide essential infrastructural support without necessarily being in contact with several others. And those infrastructural support people, I think semiconductor industry certainly can fall on that. I mean, how would we all survive without our iPhones or our other devices, right? They're important for life.
I would just add that, you know, the concept of what kind of exposure you have through the process of doing your job is another one of those criteria. So if you can do your job remotely, no one is saying that it's not essential and critical to the function of our society, but if you can do it in kind of the comfort and safety of your own home, it's a very different situation than Bernie suggests if you're actually in the manufacturing plant. So the occupational exposure risk is another moving part to this that we have to factor in.
Yep. Thanks very much for that clarification. Okay, I've got another.
So actually I should add, so the doctor that's doing mostly video visits remotely shouldn't get the vaccine as soon as the one that's working in the ICU. So let's bring it back to my job and why I'm not in the first tier.
Exactly right. Actually, neither Jeff nor Randy nor Bernie or I are, because we're not in the or Liz, or we're not in the emergency room. We're not in the ICU. We're not exposed to people that are coming in with question mark status and potentially infecting people. So here's a good one. Is there a priority for lab researchers who are working on creating therapies and treatments? And where have they been prioritized? And has that topic even been broached? Bernie, you want to take that one?
All I can say is at UCSF, laboratory workers who handle COVID and people who are working on COVID research that has to be done in person again, or exposes them to manipulating the virus samples or potentially infectious samples. So again, if you're working on COVID and can do it remotely, give your place in line to someone who's really getting exposed in the nature of going to work.
Great, thank you. So I've got a question, and I don't know if it's a Jeff question or a Randy question. Celeste Cooper asked this one: time estimates on the other vaccines that are in the pipeline. We know about Pfizer, we're hearing about Moderna coming. What about the other ones that we've all read about? Timelines for those.
So the adenovirus vaccines, there's two of them, the AstraZeneca and the Janssen, which is a branch of Johnson & Johnson, and that latter one is a one-dose vaccine. Anticipation is that they will be submitting data for approval probably the middle of February. So maybe at that point in time, you know, the AstraZeneca trials already had some issues, and some of these vaccines may be approved in other parts of the world before the United States. The Novavax, which is actually where you get the actual S protein. So you don't get the mRNA that makes the S protein, you actually get the S protein, and then you get an adjuvant which stimulates your immune system. That's probably the end of next year, recognizing that next year it's only 2 weeks away.
So Jeff, you mentioned that there are adenovirus vaccines versus what we're talking about, which are mRNA vaccines. What's the difference in profile of side effects and reactivity to adenovirus vaccines as a family compared with these mRNAs? Can you draw any conclusions or make any prognostications about what we'll see with this specific adenovirus vaccines?
No, I don't want to I'm not ready to go there.
Okay.
I mean, what I am ready to say is that, you know, the adenovirus strain that they choose, so people have had adenovirus infections before, and they have to choose a strain of adenovirus that most people have never seen anything related to. So the AstraZeneca chooses a chimpanzee strain, and the Janssen chooses a gorilla strain. So if somehow you've been exposed to a strain related to those, then you might not have a very good response to the vaccine, especially after a second dose. But as for the side effect profile, I don't really have information that I can answer. I don't know if Randy has more than I do.
Yeah, no, it's certainly an unknown. I think that if you look at the way that these vaccines work, the messenger RNA vaccine and the viral vector vaccines, which are the two that Jeff were alluding to with the adenovirus, they work in some ways in a similar fashion. And the genetic information that we want the body to take on and produce is the genetic information for the spike protein. And in the case of messenger RNA, it's just the messenger RNA for the spike protein. In the case of the viral vector, it's the genetic sequence of the spike protein is integrated into the virus. The virus doesn't replicate, so it can't cause an adenovirus infection. So in some ways, it kind of works the same way. So if I were to guess, I would guess that the symptoms, side effects are going to be relatively similar, but it is a total guess. It is a total conjecture until the FDA gets the information and then it's passed on to us. We're guessing.
Okay, great. I think I'm going to ask one last question here because it's one that does get asked quite a bit. Once there's a sufficient number of vaccines around, will people have a choice which one of the Moderna versus the Pfizer they get?
I guess it depends on your situation and where they are. And so, for example, right now, the Pfizer vaccine is only good at refrigerated temperature for 5 days, and the Moderna is good for 30 days. So you might be going, if you were to go to a CVS or a Walgreens to get your vaccine, it's very unlikely that they're going to carry the Pfizer vaccine because it's only good for 5 days in a refrigerator, and they are not going to have capabilities to keep it at minus 70 degrees centigrade for long-term storage. So it's more likely they're only have the Moderna vaccine. The Pfizer vaccine is, this is generation 1. They're already working on generation 2, which will be more stable. And when that comes out, then maybe the CVS would carry both. And then maybe competition or price to come into play if they're equivalent. And then I don't know what's going to happen with the adenovirus. So there's a fair number of unknowns there. So I can't tell you with certainty what's going to happen, but I can just say those are some of the factors that have to come into the decision whether a place carries more than one vaccine.
Thanks, Jeff. Kat, do we have time for one more question, or would you like to close out Q&A right now?
Yeah, we can do 1 or 2 more questions.
Oh, great, perfect. So Mark Toussaint asked a question. Did I get your name right? I hope so, Mark. If people show up to get their vaccine, is the prioritization scheme going to be so complex that there has to be a lot of figuring out, well, are you a 1A2 or a 1A3? How's that all going to work for people that are not part of the healthcare system, people that are in the general public? Bernie, you want to take that one?
If I can take a first start, I think we have to trust people in the honor system. We don't want to set up a system that's so cumbersome or so invasive of information that becomes a deterrent. I think at some point we have to hope and encourage, inspire people to look at not just what's good for them, but what's good for society as a whole and other people at risk. But I think you don't want to have so many bureaucratic procedures that it gets really difficult to get the shot if you want it. And it's your turn.
Randy?
And I would agree with that. I mean, I think that there's certainly the hope that we can in some way reach out to individuals that we identify either through the county or through the state as people that are particularly high risk. I mean, there's no question that we're going to have to develop some, pretty intensive outreach to get to farm workers and folks like that we consider the highest priorities. But I don't see this as a situation where we're going to be turning people away who, say that there's a justified reason why they need the vaccine because they're a teacher or a construction worker, that we're going to be turning them away. I speak for KP. I'm sure Sutter has the same opinions, and I doubt that would be happening at the county or other levels as well. If the demand is incredibly excessive and we're going to have to maybe try to devise some ways to kind of meter out the demand, but we're going to be very loath to turn people away.
Yeah, so I agree completely in speaking for Sutter, and we do not want to miss an opportunity to vaccinate someone if we have the vaccine available.
Yes, we're all very interested in getting this done. I don't know how many of you every day follow the state numbers, but all of us presenters on the call do. And there's more than 1.7 million Californians now who have been positive. And just since yesterday alone, there are 68,000 newly diagnosed people. So we want to get ahead of this as soon as we possibly can. So Kat, why don't we close out the Q&A now and pull up the poll. We'd like to ask you all if we could make this magically available to everybody on the call, how many people would feel comfortable getting it based on the information that you've learned today? And again, all answers are fine answers, as Dr. Bergen said. We're totally fine with that. We just want to hope that we've given you additional information that would boost your level of confidence. Great. Well, this is wonderful. 87% feel confident that this vaccine is worth taking. That's a big jump over the 2/3 that we saw earlier. So I hope that you all have found this to be a useful and meaningful expenditure of 90 minutes of your time. We are so appreciative of the fact that you took the time to listen, but we're really reliant on you being spokespeople and advocates for this vaccination. Please let people know that you got additional information, you heard about the safety of this, you heard about the well-defined studies that have been done, and you can be the best advocates because you're with your colleagues every day. So thank you all very much. Take care of yourselves, stay safe, wear a mask, physically distance, don't socially distance, physically distance, and take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everybody.
And a very special thank you to Drs. Lowe, Silversberg, and Eisenberg, and Villardo. Really, really appreciate having you here today.